could postpone, and we can now have your lecture, and we try to stand, and we do our best, and we all hope for victory, and everyone has its own like front line, and we are here today to listen and to discuss the topic of trauma and traumatic growth. And just give us a minute, we will explain how to use translation, okay?
Так, що пояснювати, так? Шановні учасники, значить, дивіться, я зараз, коли буду вмикати функцію перекладу, у вас з'явиться такий глобус. Там є такі реакції, потім перевод, або translation, або там українською переклад. Там буде 3 доріжки. Оригінальна, English and Ukrainian. Тобто буде 3 доріжки. Якщо ви хочете слухати англійською, просто без перекладу, ви залишаєтеся на оригінальній доріжці. Тобто там original або оригінальна. Якщо ви хочете слухати переклад, то тоді ви переходите на українську доріжку, там буде Ukrainian написано. І такий дуже важливий момент, якщо у вас будуть виникати питання, а ви на українській доріжці, пишіть їх, будь ласка, в чат, бо я їх, наприклад, не буду чути, тому що я на оригінальній доріжці, так? І, відповідно, тоді треба буде зробити переклад цих питань. Якщо ви на англійській, на оригінал цій доріжці, і у вас будуть наприкінці питання англійською мовою, ви можете ставити їх в голос. Сподіваюся, що все в нас вийде. Зараз я вмикну переклад. Приблизно годину буде лекція і виступ, і далі буде ще трошки часу на відповідь на питання. Я вас дуже прошу, вимикайте звук, бо він вмикається, це може просто випадково статися, будь ласка, вимикайте звук, щоб нам нічого з вами не заважало. Отже, я вмикаю переклад. Наташа, ти бачиш себе як перекладача чи ні? Не бачиш?
Поки ні.
Перезайти? Ні, чекай. Того разу, як ти... зараз знаєш, що я зроблю? Я отак зроблю. Начать. Вибачте. Дивіться, я бачу, що хтось запрошує розшифровку в реальному времени для конференції. Добре, я вмикну. Що, ти бачиш себе як перекладача? Все, ти бачиш, ти перейшла, так? Так, шановні учасники, чи бачите ви 3 доріжки, цей глобус, і що ви можете обрати собі доріжку або оригінальну, або українську? Всі бачать. Чудово, тоді ми можемо розпочинати. Отже, Стівен, you are welcome. We can start.
Great. All right. Well, good morning. Well, it's morning for me. It's evening for you. It's a privilege for me to be here with you. It's so difficult what you are going through. We watch the news every morning when I wake up. The first thing I do is look to the news on Ukraine, for so many friends there, and the tragedy of what's going on, but also the inspiration of what Ukraine is doing against this terrible, unprecedented aggression, or at least unprecedented in our lifetimes. Today, I'm going to be talking about traumatic growth and really going against the grain here, meaning that I am not a great believer in traumatic growth. I do believe there's a window in which it works, but that window is limited, and I think what you will see today is that from our research, which is the most comprehensive in any zone of conflict, we can see that traumatic growth actually leads mostly to negative consequences. As the famous title of the movie, which could be the title of this talk, A Bridge Too Far. If you have questions, please perhaps put them in the chat room, and Natalia, if necessary, can interrupt me, or we can address them at the end. And don't worry if you're shy about speaking, just write it down and someone will, Natalia or Mariana perhaps can address your question at the end. So just by way of introduction, this is the correct spelling of my name. You can always find my work just by Google Scholar, going to Hobfoll if you spell it correctly, because it's a made-up name from Ellis Island from over 100 years ago, when my grandfather landed on Ellis Island, and his name was written down wrong by the clerk. These are some of my books, which are available online, and that hopefully you could get and read. Now, the notions of traumatic growth are really as old as our mythology and religions. The Old Testament says, to appoint them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for their mourning, the garment of praise for their spirit of heaviness. So that positive feelings would come from trauma. The biblical story of Job is a story of finding meaning for a man who has lost everything. And Job writes, and though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet my flesh I will see God. So this transformational belief that one can have a religious meaning from traumatic events. Now, Tedeschi and Calhoun revitalized the study of traumatic growth. They enlivened its empirical study. It really hadn't been looked at before them. It reminded us that people seek meaning and spirituality when faced with trauma, and that's certainly true, that we look to spiritual and meaning when traumatic things occur. They also created a methodology for the study of traumatic growth by introducing a scale, which presented what they meant by it. Now, I see tremendous problems with their scale because, for example, the subsections don't correlate with each other, and that can't be with the scale and have a summative score, which they do use a summative score if you follow test theory. So there are problems with their scale, and unfortunately, they have not revised it accordingly. But is growth only a matter of belief? The Quran says Allah is the guardian of those who believe. He brings them out of the darkness and into the light. So this is the idea of through trauma, we find that belief is the passageway to well-being. Now, they presented their post-traumatic growth inventory, and we think it tells half the story and maybe less than half. Let's look at what is there. It talks about relating to others, new possibilities, personal strength, spiritual change. What's not there, however, growth action. So is there some act that you do when you grow, or is it just all in your head? Am I just to believe you when you say, oh yes, I've grown? If you've grown psychologically, virtually every theory within psychology says that your actions should change. Changing one's life consistent with changes in meaning. So if one finds greater meaning, one should then translate that into thoughts and actions. It should produce change outside of cognitions, and their scale doesn't go into that. It should produce change that others could see, touch, and feel. So if we follow cognitive behavioral theory, we have cognitions. Cognitions should relate to emotions. We'll look at that. We have growth cognitions. We have certain emotions that should follow, but then also we should have actions that follow. These are not attended to in the scale. Here we talk about the kind of dedicated acts, for example, of caring for a partner dying with AIDS, as is in the work of Susan Folkman. And Susan Folkman did find forms of traumatic growth for partners who were dedicated caregivers to their partner dying of AIDS. But again, this is different than just cognitions because there were growth actions. They were caring for someone else. Amidst war, there's so much trauma, and can we really ask people to grow from it? I've tried to take photos from what's going on in Ukraine. I hope that they're all appropriate. One has to watch on photos. Sometimes ones sneak in that are even from the, if you will, the enemy, although as psychologists, we care for those on all sides who are traumatized. The cognitive study of traumatic growth lacks the layered components of Viktor Frankl's notion, rarity and completing new tasks that are not merely in the mind. So it comes from the work of Viktor Frankl, and I hope all of you have read Viktor Frankl. He was really the psychologist that caused me to become a psychologist, reading his inspirational work. But let's look at what Frankl actually said. Post-traumatic growth is the individual experience of significant positive change arising from the struggle with a major life crisis. Cognitive process is an important element in the development of post-traumatic growth, says Tedeschi and Calhoun. This has led Tedeschi and Calhoun to suggest that post-traumatic growth may be independent of psychological well-being, which is completely outside of what Viktor Frankl was saying. He thought it was integral to psychological well-being. A difficult notion as it parts entirely from Frankl, Rollo May's thinking on traumatic growth. So they have on one hand taken a scale, and then perhaps because they found in so much research that it leads to bad outcomes, that they then twisted this and saying, oh, but it's independent of that. We're really not talking about the outcomes. Well, how ridiculous, because as psychologists, we always are talking about the outcomes. Let's look at what Viktor Frankl said. It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist, and here's the important words from Frankl, that entirely is out in juxtaposition or opposition to Tedeschi and Calhoun, not in talk and meditation. Again, they said, Viktor Frankl saying post-traumatic growth is not based in talk and meditation, but in right action and right conduct. Ultimately means taking responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets of each individual. So here we see that it has really, Viktor Frankl is saying that really is not about these cognitions, but rather about the actions. And I'll relate a story. A friend of mine was over with his father and mother, her father and mother for dinner. And the father and mother were both in concentration camps during World War II. And they were elderly at the time. This is some 20 years ago now. They were already in their 80s. And I was worried because dinner was running late because one of my friends who's chronically late was still not there. So I asked my friend's father, would you like something small to eat to hold off for dinner? And he said, Stephen, since my experience in the camps, I really don't get that hungry waiting for food. And then he went on, he said, when I was in the camp, I was a young and relatively strong man. And every day I used to hold a portion of the small amount of food that they gave me. And I would hold this portion and find someone that day that needed it more than I did. That's traumatic growth action. And that's what led to this individual's strength and resilience. While starving, he kept a small portion of his food for someone else that day, because the act of giving was an act of humanity within the inhumanity that was all around him. And of course, there's much in our religious writings, history, and culture of this kind of human growth. The famous poet and philosopher Kahlil Gibran wrote, "I believe that spiritual progress is a rule of human life, but the road to perfection is slow and painful. It is because the rough trail that leads to the mountain peak is not free of ambushes, of thieves, of lairs, or wolves." You must be the change that you wish to see in the world, says Mahatma Gandhi. Again, you must be the change that you see in the world. And if the change is only occurring in your head, you are not part of the change. In fact, Gandhi and so many other social and political philosophers would say, if you are not involved in action, then you're part of the problem. We framed our work on traumatic growth in part within the context of conservation of resource theory that I presented some 40 years ago. According to core theory, stress occurs in the circumstances that represent a threat of loss or actual loss of resources required, or the endpoints that are necessary to sustain the individual nested in family, nested in tribe. I use this term, individual nested in family, nested in tribe, and it's a perfect example for you to understand by what's going on in Ukraine. Of course, you are all individuals, but what are your thoughts about? They're inseparable from what's going on with your family, especially if any of your family are at risk. And of course, many of them are likely to be at risk. And yet you're also part of a tribe. This idea of Ukraine is, our borders that we've created are obviously artificial. All borders in the world are created by treaties and history. Yet you have a pride when you see the Ukrainian flag, when you sing the Ukrainian national anthem. That is because humans are tribal individuals. And probably before this war was going on, you gave little thought to Ukraine as a country. Oh, sure, perhaps you were proud that there's a Ukraine, and perhaps you rooted for the Ukrainian football team when they played, but your life was about your life and your family's life. Yet when the tribe is attacked, we become tribal. And so core theory says that under threat of loss or loss to individual, family, or tribe, this trilogy emerges more strongly. Natalia, are we doing okay for the pace? Natalia? I think you're muted. All right, I'm going to assume that we're going okay for the pace. Principles of core theory. Resource loss is disproportionately more salient than resource gain. Humans, according to the theory, are loss-oriented, meaning that our brains work to focus on loss. Our brains barely notice gain. We have much research on this, as are others, if you read our work. People must invest resources to protect against resource loss, recover from losses, and gain resources. You protect self-esteem. You invest self-esteem to protect self-esteem. You use your sense of self-efficacy to push you to do your work, to believe that you can make a difference, to give support to others. Resource gain becomes important in the context of resource loss. So this is a paradoxical prediction. The theory says, okay, loss is disproportionately more salient than resource gain. Lost love is more powerful than gained love. God forbid the loss of a child is never forgotten. Yet when we have a new baby, we celebrate it, of course, but we just don't, it doesn't invade our thoughts, at least after we catch up on our sleep. But when we're in midst loss cycles, gain becomes more important. Our brains start to focus and look for gains. Hence, we also thought that traumatic growth, seen as a resource gain in meaning, intimacy, and spirituality, would be related to resiliency in the face of trauma. So in other words, when we first went into this research, we fully thought that traumatic growth would just strictly be related to doing better. Now, in our work on the impact of terrorism, which we have these many colleagues who are involved with in this research, I list the key people here. This was a large national study of terrorism in Israel. We used phone surveys in September of 2003. We interviewed Jews and Arabs within Israel and Jews in Gaza and the West Bank. Our sample size for this was 1,012 individuals, so a very large study. We looked at resource loss resulting from the Second Intifada, which was certainly a traumatic period of rather constant attacks in Israel. We looked at traumatic growth in terms of intimacy, meaning, and spirituality that resulted from the Second Intifada. We also looked at outcome variables of PTSD and depression. We're psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, counselors, so that's what we're interested in trying to understand. We also looked at support for political violence to see how stress affected support for political violence. And we looked at ethnocentrism towards Arabs, foreign workers, and Russian immigrants. The point about Russian immigrants is many Russian Jews have moved to Israel. In fact, I think almost 20% of the country are Jews from the former Soviet Union. They are immigrants, and as in many countries, there's often anti-immigrant sentiment. We also looked at dogmatism, which is rigidity of both the left and the right. Now, the Alexa Intifada period at the time of the study, there were 138 suicide attacks, causing multiple deaths in each one, 13,730 shootings of terrorism, 313 Qassam rockets sent towards the tiny country of Israel, 963 Israelis killed, and 1 in every 4 Israelis had a friend or family member killed, which I believe would be still higher than the data in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, the point being that this is a major time of conflict and helps us understand this major time of conflict in Ukraine. Terrorists especially target places where Jews and Arabs might peacefully coexist. In other words, civilian settings. Again, very similar in that way to what's going on in Ukraine with Russia attacking civilian areas. We found PTSD among 6.6% of Jews and 18% of Palestinians. So the PTSD being quite high. To put it in perspective, during normal periods of non-conflict, we probably see about 1.5% of the population with PTSD. Now, let's look at significant predictors of PTSD diagnosis. And here we're going to look at logistic regression for Jews as expressed in odds ratios. This is first for Jews. Now, this is the odds of having PTSD compared to whatever the comparison group is based as 1. I'll explain. So women are 1.27 times more likely than men to have PTSD. In other words, about 27% more likely. Those with high income are about 28% less likely than those with low income to have PTSD. Being religious, well, the secular, we place them at 1 because they're the lowest group. That's arbitrary. We call them 1. Those who are traditionally religious, in other words, following some religious practices, are almost 3 times or 271% more likely to have PTSD. And the religious are less likely than the secular, slightly less likely to have PTSD, although not significant. And remember, in a place like Israel, the religious are ultra-religious, ultra-fundamentalists. So these would be religious people as you'd probably most know them in Ukraine, churchgoers who would follow Christian Catholic doctrine. This would be, I guess in Ukraine, people like monks and priests, perhaps. Those with direct exposure, no direct exposure, we arbitrarily place them as 1. And we see those with direct exposure are 2.25 times, 225% more likely to have PTSD. Those with social support, low, we place them at 1. And we see those with high social support are about 72% less likely to have PTSD than those with low social support. Economic loss. Well, here we start looking at core theory, and we see that those with high economic loss are 4 times, over 400%, to be exact, 418% more likely than those with low economic loss. And although one might say, oh, we shouldn't think about money during war, but I'm sure what your experience is, the economic loss that you're experiencing in this war as it impacts families, is a very important factor. And in fact, one of the targets that Putin is trying to attack, because he feels that if he breaks the Ukrainian people's economy, he can break them. Psychosocial loss. Those with low loss, again, we place arbitrarily. We call the lowest group 1 arbitrarily. And with those with medium loss, 2.5 times more likely. And then look at this with high loss. And this is, again, core theory is so important here. We have almost 800%, 8 times more likely, those with high psychosocial loss than those with low loss to have PTSD. Again, look at that compared to these other factors, how large a factor resource loss is. It is the largest predictor of outcomes. Now let's look at traumatic growth. These are people who say that they've grown from this traumatic set of experience. Those with low growth are have the least PTSD. Those with medium growth are about just under 2 times more likely to have PTSD. And look at those with high growth are almost 300% more likely to have PTSD. In other words, the more that individuals reported traumatic growth, the more PTSD they had. Now we'll look at predictors of PTSD diagnosis of Palestinians as opposed to the Jews. And again, taking this through, let me just put out the data quickly. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back there. So here we have for education is a protective factor. Those with high education have about half the PTSD. For economic loss, 2.3 times or 230% higher than those with low loss. Those with high psychosocial loss, about 300% more likely to have PTSD. Those with low social support, 0.5. And I'm looking for the traumatic growth. I'm wondering if it got, I'm sorry, I think that must have gotten covered underneath these photos, which should have come up. They should have loaded after, sorry. But again, for Palestinians, as for Jews, the higher the traumatic growth, the higher the PTSD. We can also look at this in terms of the structural equation model, and this brings up another point that I think is devastating to those who think that traumatic growth is just purely this wonderful thing. Here we have loss of psychosocial resources. We see before the slash is Jews, after our Palestinians. We see, as we'd expect, loss of psychosocial resources related to greater depression, loss of psychosocial resources for both groups related to greater PTSD. We see for social support that social support is related for both groups to less depression and less PTSD. Let's look at traumatic growth, however. As we saw before, traumatic growth is related significantly, even if a low correlation, low structural path, actually, to PTSD, but still, more traumatic growth is worse. But then let's look at this further. Those who report high traumatic growth are more likely to support political violence. And our measures of political violence were, we didn't even know if some people would support them because they're the use of, using political violence against civilians, condoning political violence even where it targets children, political violence in terms of terrorist acts, political violence in terms of assassination. So we see that those who report greater traumatic growth are more likely to want to kill the enemy, not what Viktor Frankl was talking about in traumatic growth. We also see that those who are higher in traumatic growth also want to, are higher on ethnic exclusion. They're more anti-immigrant. They're more hateful. How different this is from Viktor Frankl's idea of growth being a source of nurturance and compassion. It is the opposite of that for those involved in traumatic circumstances. And next we see this is only for Jews only. And we see that here it's the same, but also we see that traumatic growth relates to greater PTSD, which also then relates to wanting to have greater exclusion of Arabs from the Israeli economy, pushing them out of the country, more right-wing attitudes. So traumatic growth relates to greater PTSD, which relates here to greater right-wing push, greater dogmatism, which is political extremism, rigidity, and greater support for political violence. We then repeated this design in another three-way perspective study. This is the only three-way perspective study, even still today, in a zone of conflict that I'm familiar with. If you find otherwise, please email me that information. I'd like to incorporate it in future talks. Here we see a structural equation model. Well, I'm sorry, these are cross-lagged correlations. In a three-way study of Jews and Arabs. As we'd expect, greater exposure to terrorism is related to greater PTSD, and also those who are being exposed have sort of a continuity of exposure. Well, this occurs as with you. There are safer zones in Ukraine. Of course, those who are in zones of greater conflict are going to experience increased likely exposure. Here we have, for Arabs, we have the same terror exposure, the cross-lagged relationship. The most important one is this three-wave cross-lag. So terrorism exposure relates to greater PTSD, even though on the verge of significance. Here's now for psychosocial resource loss. And what we see here is that, as core theory predicts, that psychosocial loss is an important predictor cross-lag of PTSD. Look at the simultaneous relationship there of loss with PTSD. And then we have this also for Arabs, the loss, well, the cross-lagged one, cross three-wave is not significant, but that's also because it's controlling for the cross-sectional one. Certainly the total relationship is significant. Well, you see here, it's significant at each time. So psychosocial loss, highly related to PTSD at time 1, highly related to PTSD at time 2, highly related to PTSD at time 3. Social support, again, it's important for us to look at not just traumatic growth, but these other variables, because perhaps there's a problem with our study or our findings with other things not related as we'd expect them. But here we see social support related to lower PTSD as we'd expect at each time point, and the cross-lagged relationship being significant. This is for Jews. And for Arabs, although not significant in the cross-lag, significant in several of the simultaneous, and it is significant in this cross-lag here. Now let's look at traumatic growth. As we see here for Jews, traumatic growth is related at each point to greater PTSD, not lesser. And let's look at over time, because perhaps what might occur according to Tedeschi and Calhoun is at times, over time, traumatic growth gives you strength. Well, if it gives you strength, psychologically, we would say that you should have less PTSD, but no. Even controlling for earlier PTSD, the more traumatic growth, the more your PTSD grows, not decreases. I would point out there is no study of traumatic growth showing relationship with doing better over time in any tier 1 journal, even after thousands of studies of traumatic growth. Here we have for depression, it's really the same thing. I won't go over each of the individual. Now let's look at our next study with my good colleague, Brian Hall, looking at Israeli settlers in Gaza. Now, these settlers had moved to Gaza to create a new life. I'm not going to speak to the politics of it, other than to say, in fact, I am personally not in favor of the Israeli settlers being in the former territories. But again, we study people because we care about people and what's happening to them. To us, in this sense, for civilian populations, as psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, there is no enemy in the sense of the care that we want to give. So these settlers personify living their dream. They were living in very rough circumstances. They chose to build their lives in dangerous surroundings with thousands of sniper and Katyusha rocket attacks. They had to have their children travel in armored buses to school and patrolling their children's schools with machine guns to protect them. Very difficult circumstances. Now, due to a political solution, they were forced to pull out of Gaza. And we thought this was an excellent test of major and accelerated period of resource loss, because they had built homes, they had built livelihoods, they had built their dream. They were spiritual, religious people, so they had built their religious home in their in the land of biblical Israel for them. Here we see Israeli soldiers, unarmed, actually physically pulling settlers out to remove them. So very difficult for both the soldiers who are being used these are Israeli soldiers pulling Israelis out, forcing them to leave their home. Very difficult on the soldiers. Many of the soldiers themselves, we see he has the religious head covering. These two soldiers are themselves religious. Children involved in the pullout, so very difficult on the soldiers' lives, and very dedicated from the settlers' point of view of what you see the trauma that they're going through. We looked at 189 settlers removed from the land under duress, experiencing major economic and social resource loss. We did phone surveys during the week of evacuation. The mean profile of our participants were 37 years of age. Most were married. Most were Orthodox religious Jews, and about even % of women and men. We see very high rates of depression and probable PTSD in the group. This is a highly traumatic event for them. What are our findings? Some have suggested that strong religious beliefs lead to resiliency. We repeatedly find, as we did here, that religious Jews were no different than secular Jews in PTSD or depression. Religious belief itself is not protected. And we've found this over and over again. Moderately religious Jews were at appreciably higher risk, actually, almost twice the rates of PTSD and depression than secular or the very religious. Nor is older wiser, as older individuals actually had higher rates of PTSD and depression. Let's look at the impact of economic, psychosocial loss and traumatic growth on settlers. We divide here in low, medium, and high, a three-way split. Low economic loss, fairly low PTSD. Medium loss, higher. Look at the impact of high economic loss. We see, again, loss. These are percent meeting criteria. So 35% met criteria of PTSD with high economic loss, as opposed to 10% with low economic loss. Psychosocial loss. Low loss, about 7% have PTSD. Medium loss, about 18%. And then look at this for high loss. Again, tremendous support for conservation resource theory. Those with high loss, more than half develop PTSD. Now let's look at traumatic growth. Low growth, about 35% PTSD. Medium growth, about 30%. High growth, 15%. Finally, those with highest traumatic growth are doing better. Why is this going on? Well, as opposed to the other studies, this is not growth beliefs. These are growth actions. They are translating their growth to action. And again, for depression, we see the same thing. Again, look at the impact of psychosocial loss. For core theory, almost 60% of those who report high loss are depressed. But unlike our other studies, traumatic growth is protective because, and I think this is excellent for you to think about in terms of Ukraine, so many of you are translating your growth beliefs to growth actions by offering support for others, by being there, even by becoming combatants, aid workers, offering, helping with getting food to others. Acts of traumatic growth actions. So our conclusions: resource loss is a powerful predictor of psychological distress and functioning. As core theory predicts, resource loss is the best predictor of outcomes. Resource loss predicts prospectively, and its influence is not a compound of psychological distress indicators. The impact of resource loss is a major aspect of the substance of why many other indicators, such as prior trauma, prior PTSD and exposure, predict psychological distress and functioning. Our findings for traumatic growth. I'm sorry, oh, gotta go back there. Oh, I don't know what happened. Oh, no. For traumatic growth, people seek traumatic growth quite common in the face of tragedy. So certainly true that people seek traumatic growth. No doubt about that. Oh. Cognitive traumatic growth may be an indication of wishful thinking, rumination, or backward justification. Breaking my legs must have been a good thing if I went through all that pain. So we retrospectively think, oh, because this happened, I have to think it was good. Something good must have come out of it. Traumatic growth actions are rare, as Viktor Frankl said, but may be critical in providing actual benefit from traumatic experience. So it's not the traumatic growth cognitions that are important. It's when we translate them to traumatic growth actions. We are at the beginning of understanding traumatic growth, and unfortunately, we believe that Tedeschi and Cahoon have it mostly wrong. I'm going to end here. I added other studies which are in the slide set, which I've shared with you to look at. They support our findings, and I think they'll be interesting for you to look at. But we can stop my part of the presentation now, and we can move to questions.
So, Steven, thank you very much for your lecture, and we really appreciate it. And now we need to decide how can we ask questions. We have two possibilities. The first possibility, if you know English and you are on the original channel in English, you can answer your questions in English. And if you are on the Ukrainian or on the channel there you listen to the translation, you can answer your questions, but only in the chat, because I don't hear you. Or all of us can switch to the original channel and make our conversation here. Natalia, do you hear me? And how can we do? Наталія. Не бачу Наталію. Так, я ж тебе не чую, то ти мені скажи, як будемо робити. Переключимся все? Я тебя не слышу. Чекай. Да, я тебя не... О, теперь я тебя слышу.
Ти можеш мене взагалі повернути, і я буду в основному перекладати.
Добре. А як
Так?
тебе
Давай.
повернути?
А забрати мене функцію перекладача, мабуть.
Сейчас
А ну-ка. Забери, і я буду з вами усіма.
Закрепить, сделать организацию.
Забрать? Можеш?
Не могу я тебе нічого забрати. Зараз English, управління переводом. Зараз. Завершить. Повертаю.
О, yes. Okay. Steven, you couldn't hear me because I was interpreting. So when you are on the channel, so only Ukrainians can hear. So sorry for some discrimination, but now we can answer questions and probably we can do it not simultaneously. But can I be the first to ask you, do you have any maybe scientific research that maybe are undergoing right now, maybe in Ukraine, or maybe you know about any scientific research about traumatic growth? Я запитала, чи проводяться якісь дослідження щодо травматичного зростання зараз і безпосередньо, можливо, в Україні? Чи знає Стівен щось про це?
I only know I've been contacted by several colleagues for permission to use my scales, but I don't know what's happened in terms of what's going on with their research. But these are certainly possibilities for you and your students to do. There's an endless number of theses and dissertations that are possible here. And the group works together to create a data set. You may be able to get a large data set because you have the potential for example, if 20 of you got together and each of you spoke to 50 people, then you have a 1,000-person study. You want to work out the methodology to make sure that you're not just talking to your friends and having to buy a sample, but you have an enormous opportunity here, which would be very important for scientific contributions in times of conflict.
Тобто на даний момент, можливо, не проводиться, але, скажімо, це дуже гарна опція. І якщо навіть кожен опитає 50 і зробити таку робочу групу, то це велика така можливість для досліджень магістерських чи навіть дисертацій, тому що тема є дуже важливою. І ми якраз ті, хто безпосередньо може приймати участь, єдине важливе дуже так методологію розробити, щоб дослідити це науково коректно. Будь ласка, колеги, які ще методики, да? Там,
В чаті питання.
Okay, yeah, there was a question about the instrument. Probably, how did you study? What about like methods and methodology?
Yeah. So I believe that in the slide deck, I'm pretty sure in the slide deck that we present, I presented the actual questions that we looked at. We also did a study because, as you imagine, Tedeschi and Calhoun were not happy with our research. So they said, oh, their scale is bad. So then we did a study. We used their scale and our scale, and we showed that the scale, our scale had better psychometric properties, but the two scales were correlated at 0.9. And if you understand testing theory, if two scales correlate 0.9, that's higher than the error variance. So that means they are identical in terms of their concept. So with our scale is A, better than theirs psychometrically. It doesn't have this problem of subsections having opposite correlations with each other. Some of their subscales have negative correlations with other portions of their subscale, opposite of their own theory. And the total scores are correlated over 0.9. And this was a study we did and published with Brian Hall as the author of, I think, 245 participants. So you can look at those items. It's also a Breeder scale, so it's easy to administer.
Чи, Мар'яна, це звук і такий трошки, да?
Ну, я
Зі
не знаю,
звуком, да.
чому. Я всі
There is something with the sound, but I can translate. You are now sound like very old man somehow. So some sort connection, but I will interpret. Тобто трошки зі зв'язком проблеми, але якщо подивитися на слайди, до речі, презентація, вона трошки інший варіант, але може бути доступний за бажання. Ви можете запитати, і там було відображено, що перш за все, де досліджувалися, там були прізвища тих, хто розробляв, і найважливіше це показники, коли ось ці кореляції, коли досліджували ПТСР, рівень депресії, і дивилися, що відбувається з часом, то такі на основі того, що бачили, вибірка була більше 1000 людей, і це було таке лонгітюдне дослідження, то потім вимірювали на початку, після, і дивилися саме які зв'язки, але можна подивитися і вибудувати свою певні як методологію, але насправді, якщо передивитися слайди, то там може певна інформація, в тому числі, хто розробляв методологію дослідження. Ось Тадеуш і ще один прізвище.
Тадеш Калхаун є методика посттравматичного зростання. Мене більше цікавило для дослідження ресурсів, чи є методика саме у Стівена. Так, у Стівена.
And speaking about research of resources, do you have any special maybe method, maybe special technology how you can measure resources?
Yeah. Two things. I've shared it on the screen. Can you see the slide?
Yes, so we can see.
Here's our scale. Just a 6-item scale. Feel closer to at least one other person. This is related to the trauma. As following this traumatic event, so you would say, given the events occurring in Ukraine, do you feel closer to at least one other? Do you have more feelings in total? More feelings in life has meaning or purpose, more intimacy with family, closer relationship with friends, and increased confidence in your ability to do things. So those would be items.
Отже, якщо дивитися на ось такі зростання чи наявність відсутність ресурсів, то це було ось 6 питань, як вимірів, коли запитують, чи наскільки ви ближче стали, чи маєте почуття надії, чи маєте ви збільшення почуття такого значення, чи збільшилися стосунки з друзями, чи збільшилася здатність ваша. Тобто ось ці відповіді, вони дають розуміння про наявність чи відсутність травматичного зростання і наявність чи відсутність певних ресурсів.
Now, related to your next question, we have the conservation of resource evaluation. It's a 74-item scale. The individuals responded to their degree of loss, their degree of gain. You can also look at the threat of loss and promise of gain. So you may not have experienced loss yet, but you fear the loss of your loved one, for example, or economic loss. You don't have to use all 74 items. There's many studies published, hundreds of studies published to this day, actually thousands. And you can look at groups of resources. We just suggest that you have at least 3 within each category area.
А якщо казати про дослідження, то є окремий ще як шкала вимірювання ресурсів, це як такі 8 рівнів, і там також можна дослідити, тобто пошукати, тому що насправді є навіть не сотні, а тисячі, мабуть, досліджень, які присвячені темі збереження ресурсів, і це також, знаєте, така досліджувана тема, тому є і окремий там опитувальник. And Steven, we understand that you are studying the issue and you have many interesting, conclusions. So, and it's a difficult maybe ask, but can you give some kind of advice? Because now we are in the situation and we are undergoing still, yeah, so it's difficult simultaneously to understand what's going on and to move on, but maybe some advice.
I think in terms of, I think the important clinical implications here, if that's what you're asking, is that people can feel worse because they think, well, I'm not growing from this. And this is what we call it a bridge too far. You know, if you're just living your life, if you're just continuing to get up in the morning, have your coffee, and do the things that you need to do, that's all that we should ask of people. And you want to reward them for that. And that's whether it's a mother caring for or father caring for their children, that's going to work, living life as normal as possible. One of the challenges we have in such conflict is this challenge to try to break you from your life. And just standing up against that is a tremendous act.
Питання було про те, що вивчаючи питання травматичного зростання, звичайно, як науковець, Стівен робив наукові висновки для нас, для людей, які ще знаходяться в складній ситуації. Я запитала, чи можна якісь надати як рекомендації, і Стівен сказав, що найважливіше, особливо для нас, як для професіоналів, пам'ятати, що іноді, досліджуючи цю тему травматичного зростання, очікують, що люди якось змінюються, чи, знаєте, стають сильнішими, міцнішими, чи щось обов'язково повинно змінитися, то насправді найважливіше – це продовжувати жити. І може це навіть, знаєте, таке звичайне життя, коли батьки піклуються про своїх дітей, чи ми продовжуємо жити і зранку стаємо, починаємо з кави, да, ось майже нічого не змінилося, але це є також важливо, тому що найтаке, що хочуть забрати, це звичне життя. І ось насправді ось це травматичне зростання, воно може проявлятися в тому, що ми залишаємося, живемо своїм звичним життям, і це є вже важливим. Не варто очікувати, особливо в професійному такому плані, що люди повинні якось щось зростати, якось щось повинно з ними відбуватися. Такого. Якщо вони залишаються, вміти піклуватися, підтримують стосунки, то це вже є дуже-дуже важливим і цінним. Thank you.
I think also it's odd, but there's a kind of humor that grows that we see, and the ability to laugh even amidst such terrible circumstances is a tremendous shield against what's going on. One of my nieces was in the former Yugoslavia, and it was, of course, terrible because the enemy was using rape as a weapon of war. And there were a bunch of women of all ages sheltered and fearing the enemy coming. And this was all on their minds. And one of the grandmothers, a woman weighing over 100 kilos, 80 years old, says, "Oh, I hope I don't get raped." And it just made them, all the rest of them, laugh because she was, they thought, the least likely for this to happen to, and she's worried about it also. And just her saying it just made them laugh and made them feel better, somehow stronger. And it was something that my niece remembered years later. These traumas, they impact us in ways that it's going to take a lifetime for you to understand. And you will be processing this in some ways for the rest of your lives. There's no way that it's otherwise. So doing the work of everyday life, remaining connected to others, again, being proud of just participating in what you can do are the most important things. And we are privileged as mental health professionals and even students in this area because we expect things to contribute, which is critical to the war effort because war is won when you break the spirit psychologically of the other side. It is my prediction that the Russian army is and will continue to collapse because of this lack of spirit. You can contribute to Ukraine most of all by contributing to the strength in the spirit of individuals. And again, from what we've talked about today, not expecting too much of them on the other hand. So it is understandable that one gets depressed, that one gets sad, that one is anxious, even that one develops PTSD. The more that we can treat it and make people stronger to go on for the next day, the more that we're contributing, and for your personal well-being, you will feel that you've contributed, that you've done something that's important, because it is terribly important.
Sorry, I will translate, and actually our lecture today, I hope also can contribute, because despite everything, we can be together and to find, look for important issues. Отже, Стівен також додав, що дуже важливим є почуття гумору, тому що насправді, коли ти маєш силу посміятися, попри всі обставини, він пригадував, що навіть у нього є племінниця, яка з Югославії проходила також досвід військовий, там згадувала, що в тому числі було дуже жахливих подій, наприклад, ось використання сексуального насильства, на жаль, це така частина зброї військової, і там також, коли група жінок була, де навіть, знаєте, такі пригадується, коли жінки могли шуткувати з цього, цієї теми, це вже здавалося таким дуже важливим. Насправді, те, що зараз відбувається, все життя піде, мабуть, на інтеграцію цього наш особистий досвід, і не варто очікувати, що все зрозуміється, тому що насправді це такий дуже-дуже серйозний вплив. І тут також для нас, як представників сфери психічного здоров'я, є важливим, тому що насправді одна з завдань війни дуже таким зламати дух. І ось ми, як професіонали психічного здоров'я, те, що ми докладаємо зусиль, ми підтримуємо дух, і ми надаємо ось цю психологічну підтримку, це є дуже важливою частиною, це те, що для нас може бути особисто значимим, і це також може вести до перемоги. То насправді, ось дійсно, навіть якщо є ПТСР, воно буде депресія, будуть проблеми, але вміння вставати вже те, що встали, вже діємо, це дуже важлива частина. І насправді, ще раз, не очікувати, що після травматичного зростання це якісь такі дуже-дуже значні зміни. Але наша здатність залишатися тут, працювати, наприклад, прийти на цю лекцію попри обстріли, проблеми з електрикою, з інтернет-зв'язком і так далі, це вже частина ось цього дії. Це те, що ми не здаємося, не зламуємося, ми продовжуємо діями, це вже свідчить, що у нас з вами відбувається акт цього після травматичного зростання. Але не варто очікувати дуже багато. Якщо залишаємося в стосунках, якщо можемо працювати, якщо можемо підтримувати свої повсякденні якісь ритуали, ритми життя, це вже дуже-дуже добре.
I'll also say, I'm glad to answer other questions, but so you've gained a friend and colleague now, all of you. I know students often think, I couldn't contact Professor Hobfol. Dr. Mozilla can share my email. I welcome that you contact me with your questions. I'm a psychologist that not only understands things theoretically, but I'm a former officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, lived amidst war and terrorism. So I understand both theoretically and, as we say, I can't just talk the talk, I walk the walk.
Тобто, насправді, якщо є залишилося питання, то Стівен радий буде відповісти, і якщо буде, я залишу тут мій емейл для тих, кому цікаво буде отримати презентацію, перекладену українською мовою, це трошки згодом. Вона малюнками може відрізнятися, тому що там було 2 версії, але буде перекладене. І друге, якщо якісь є дійсно питання, які ви хочете звернутися, то Стівен запрошує, можна буде йому написати, тому знову-таки я поділюся імейлом для тих, хто хоче отримати певні відповіді. And sorry, there was one question also. Does it depends their religion, like who are you, Catholic or Muslim or Christian, and does it influence? It just doesn't say the original question. Олена Маліборська, залежить вірування від чого? Мається на увазі, питання було про що? Що можна голосом озвучити, тому що не зовсім зрозуміло. Чи залежить, яке вірування залежить, на що впливає, від чого? Що мали на увазі?
Я хотіла спитати, люди якої віри найбільш
Про
християни, чи мусульмани, чи якої віри люди більш стійкі до травм? Виходять.
Так, дякую. So it was about post-traumatic growth and maybe not even resilience. Do you have any data maybe about type of religion and the most resilient people, or does it even connect?
Yeah. We have never found religious belief to matter other than among the ultra-religious. But these are people like priests and monks, super fundamentalists. They're usually quite separate from the world. So, for example, in Israel, you might see pictures of the ultra-Orthodox. They don't even read, they're not allowed to read newspapers or watch the news. They are separated from the world. So they perhaps do better in such periods. But we have studied among our group has studied Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, Buddhists. In general, those who are secular do better than those that are religious. The only religious finding you ever found is religious husbands think their wives are doing better. But when we looked at their wives aren't doing better. And these were studies that we did of when parents have extremely ill children.
Насправді були дослідження, але немає ось такої певної релігії, яка, ви знаєте, і пов'язана з резильєнтністю. Тут більше є така ультрарелігійна, мається на увазі, дійсно, чи це священнослужителі, чи, знаєте, високий рівень релігійності та духовності. Але тут знову-таки залежить не від якого типу релігії, а від того, наскільки духовною є людина. Тому немає такої прямої кореляції, і чи то грек, католик, християнин, мусульмани тут не настільки важливо. І дійсно проводилися окремі дослідження, то тут якраз таки більше про стан такої духовності людини, наскільки але там вже працюють трошки інші, як то кажуть, закони. Да? Це не про релігійність, а про рівень такої, можливо, організації самої людини. Ми, враховуючи час, ми маємо завершуватися, то давайте дійсно, якщо, можливо, хтось хоче сказати щось коротеньке Стівену, то можна сказати. Знаєте, такі 1-2 речення, 3 про свої враження, можливо, якщо хоче хтось поділитися. Немає бажаючих, мабуть.
Просто щиро подякувати за те, що Стівен відкликається.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presence, your lecture, and for your being with us.
І ділиться своїм досвідом, дуже важливо для нас.
Your experience and your research. Thank you so much.
Glory to Ukraine. I am with you emotionally, and again, all of us, we are now all colleagues. You're my colleague now, and hopefully friends. And let's look forward to future times when we can gather together and break bread together, share some drinks in Ukraine in the not too distant future.
Дякую. Я хочу сказати, що я щиро підтримую, знаєте, вас і емоційно ми з вами, щиро висловлюю підтримку вас, і ви, як мої професіонали, я дуже буду радий, якщо вдасться побачитися особисто, тому що я планую приїхати на Україну, то дійсно сподіваюся, що ми в тому числі, можливо, і зустрінемося, і, знаєте, як то кажуть, на пляшечку кави. And there are